She survived 3 ship sinkings, but nothing could stop her. She was on the Titanic's sister ships, and Violet Jessup, Miss Unsinkable, was my grandmother. She rescued my mom as a baby from the Titanic and adopted her. I'm here to share both her story and my mom's story with you. Imagine being trapped in icy water so cold you can't breathe, while the Titanic sinks right in front of you. You see people crying and screaming, men, women, and children rushing through the ship to get to the lifeboats. Everyone is fighting for survival. This may have only happened once to the passengers and crew of the Titanic, but my grandmother, Violet, experienced this disaster 3 times on 3 sister ships. She survived each one and went on to work as a stewardess on cruise liners. The most famous of them was the Titanic. But Violet's heroism didn't end there. She saved my mother, just a 3-month-old baby, from her own mother, who had frozen to death in the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean. I'm here to tell you about my grandmother's childhood and story. Violet Jessup, who is famously known as Miss Unsinkable, had a tough time when she was a child. She would always tell her stories when I was around 5 or 6, during the visits we made to her home in Great Ashfield, Suffolk. Whenever we visited her, she would start telling her tales at night, and her stories inspired my mother and me to be brave and hardworking, just like she was. She would often say, "I didn't have a childhood and I never really understood how I grew up. Everything happened so fast, and I felt like I was an adult even when I was just 5 or 6. I had to take care of my siblings. And my siblings weren't just 1, 2, or 3, I was the oldest of 9 children. I woke up every day, cleaned the house, took care of my siblings, washed the dishes, and helped my mom with cooking. She was around 40, but she looked like a 60-year-old woman because of all the hardships she had faced. She would often say, when I was about 15, I got a bad disease. My body ached so badly that I cried all night until morning. When my parents took me to the doctor said I wouldn't survive because I was so weak." But Violet would always add, "Your grandmother was so brave and strong, I made it and I survived." I was always curious about my grandmother, constantly asking her about her feelings. I even asked if she had ever fallen in love or had feelings for someone. She would always reply, "I didn't have time to fall in love with someone. All my love and feelings happened on the ships. They stayed for a month and then disappeared into the sea. All the guys I loved were just temporary passengers, my guests, traveling from one place to another." She moved to England with her mother, took care of her siblings, and later attended a convent school. She would say, "My mother was a stewardess at sea. She would always pick me up and take me to the ships when she felt sick, and I would always help her with her tasks on the ships. That's why I came to like this job. When everyone asked, 'What's your favorite job?' I would say, 'A stewardess.'" My grandmother would add, "My mother would always tell me, 'You should become a doctor and help people survive and stay alive, not work on ships and lose your whole life.' But I was in love with that job and couldn't imagine doing anything else." My grandmother would always say, "I never regret choosing this job, and I never left it, even after surviving 3 ship sinkings in the ocean." Oh, Violet would say that I followed in my mother's footsteps and wanted to work there after my mother passed away. My 8 other siblings needed money and food after my dad was unable to work anymore following my mother's death. I used to take them to our aunt's house and then go to the shipping company, begging them to hire me. Violet would say, "I used to go into every room in the shipping company and show them my mother's evidence of 20 years of work there, begging them to hire me. I was around 18 at the time. But the managers and the shipping company's director refused to hire me, for a ridiculous reason. 'You're so young and beautiful, you'll distract the passengers and the crew, and we don't want that happening in our line.' My grandmother would say, it was really stupid that they didn't hire me with all my experience from those years. But I never gave up. I found another way to get into the job." My grandmother would laugh when telling this part of her story. She said, "One day when I got home and was disappointed at not being hired, I stood in front of the mirror and started crying out loud. I asked myself, why should I be beautiful? Do I really need to be beautiful? And at that moment I came across a solution. What if I went to the interviews looking bad, like not doing my hair or wearing unsuitable clothes? Or what if I wore makeup that made me look ugly? That's when I decided to try it." She would say, "The next day I woke up, didn't brush my teeth, and went to the shipping company in my worst, dirtiest clothes with my unkempt hair to show them I didn't care about my appearance and was ready to work hard on the ship. And it worked. I was hired that day." But she would also say, "I had no idea what destiny had in store for me, or what my story would be with the 3 sister ships, RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and HMHS Britannic." My grandmother would say that the first 2 years of her job were the greatest times of her life. Her trips were mostly from Southampton, England, to New York, USA, and they usually took about 5 to 7 days to reach their destination. She would help the passengers and the crew, enjoying the luxurious and safe ship without worrying about technical issues. At that time, their trips were on the Olympic ship, part of the White Star Line. The engineers who constructed the ships didn't focus on the speed. They only cared about the comfort of the passengers. Once, I asked my grandmother, "Grandma, how much did they pay you? Because it was the most luxurious liner of that time." My grandmother replied, In 1910, they paid just £2 a month, the equivalent of about £200 today. She would work on the ship's deck from early morning till dusk, and she loved her job. She was an outgoing and beautiful young woman. She would talk to people, drink with them, dance with them, and have fun. She met actors and singers who performed on the ship. She even saw Jack and Rose on the Titanic. She would watch dancers teach her how to dance and teachers give her lessons. But the most heartbreaking lesson she learned came from destiny on those 3 ships. I would often ask her about her first survival, and she would tell the story. She would say, "It was one of those cold days on September 20th, 1911. I was working on the deck, and everything seemed fine. I was playing with my clock, which hung around my neck, looking at the time. It was around 5 p.m. The sky had not darkened yet, and I could see the beautiful views of the Atlantic. The sky was pink and the sea was purple. The ship was sailing through the Solent Strait, which separates the Isle of Wight from the British mainland. At that moment, the British military cruiser Hawke appeared ahead. It should have passed by the Olympic, but we could see the cruiser getting closer and closer. Something wasn't right. The cruiser should have been moving farther away from us, but instead it was coming closer. I started running. I knew something was wrong, so I ran to the back of the ship away from the front, because I could feel the danger. The ships were heading straight toward each other. Our captain was trying to steer away from it to avoid a collision, but it was impossible. She would continue. It was designed to ram other ships, so avoiding this unintentional accident was impossible. I was staring at the cruiser like I was watching a horror movie in a cinema. I couldn't do anything but watch. I saw how it rammed into the Olympic with a loud boom. The liner shuddered and people started yelling and shouting. I was in shock. And I was thrown hard to the ground because I was standing. The force of the impact hit my head and body hard. I was stuck on the ground like a pancake, unable to stand up. I was terrified and panicking. Not just me, but everyone on the ship felt the same way. I struggled to get up and went closer to see what had happened. A huge hole was on the starboard side. I started crying and told myself, the Olympic is going to sink. I was waiting for the crew members to give the order to evacuate, but no orders came. Luckily, both ships stayed afloat and no one was hurt. There were no fires, just a big hole in the ship. It felt like God had embraced me. I would always ask my grandma, "Grandma, why didn't you leave that job after the accident? Didn't you feel afraid that it could happen again? You knew the ship wasn't a safe place, didn't you?" She would always smile kindly and say, "Because I was made for that job. I wasn't afraid of dying. I wanted to be on the water, not on land, because I felt like I was in another world. I could meet new people and learn new things there. And despite the accident, we were so lucky it didn't terrify us too much. I went back to working as a stewardess on that line." She would say, "My second survival was my most beautiful, because it gave me your mother, and you." She would always cry while telling the Titanic story, kissing my forehead. She would continue, "It was one of those heavenly April days when I got a job on the best ship, the one they called Unsinkable. The ship sank, but I remained unsinkable." She would laugh out loud every time she said this part to me and others. We would laugh too. She was truly unsinkable. I would ask, "Grandma, how did you get onto that ship?" She would tell me, there were famous slogans and phrases about Titanic at the time like, "This ship is unsinkable," or "The Queen of the Ocean." Others would say, "Your dreams come true on the Titanic." I had worked on the Olympic and experienced its luxury, beauty, and ease. But I wondered, what could be better than the Olympic? What was Titanic really like inside? In April 1912, I took a job on Titanic. I was supposed to serve the VIPs. At first, I didn't want to join the trip because I had some problems with my dad's illness and needed to stay with him to take care of him. But my dad and aunt urged me to go. They offered a good salary and they said our lives would be transformed if I got the job there. But my friends persuaded me, so I made my final decision and boarded the ship. Titanic was truly titanic and grand. It was luxurious and eye-kegging. We left the port of Southampton that day and the first few days were peaceful. Singers would perform at night and dancers would dance. I once saw Jack painting and had a brief conversation with him. He told me, "I want to draw your picture," but I refused. He insisted, saying my eyes were pure and endless. He drew my eyes and I still have that drawing. 3 days passed peacefully, but on the 4th day, disaster struck. It was around night when I was resting in my cabin. I was asleep, but also feeling a bit sick because I had worked so much on the ship that my legs and hands ached terribly. I remember crying before I fell asleep, missing my dad, my siblings, and my aunt. The hardest thing I realized that day was that the salary I'd been promised wasn't as much as my dad had hoped for. I didn't know if he would still be alive when I returned home, and how could I tell him that my salary was barely more than what I had earned on the Olympic? These feelings weighed heavily on me and I fell asleep in pain and sorrow. When I was deep in my dreams, I suddenly felt the jolt. I ran out of my cabin, dressed quickly, and was called to the upper deck by my colleagues. What had happened? The Titanic, the Unsinkable, the dream ship, had struck an iceberg. No one initially understood what had happened. The ship hitting the iceberg, sinking, and filling with water was like a termite, slowly eating away at the ship from the inside. No one could believe the Titanic was actually sinking. I always asked my grandmother, "How could that happen, Grandma? Why didn't anyone panic?" She would kindly answer, "At the same time the ship was flooding from below, everyone on the upper decks was still having fun, dancing and singing. Some were deep in their sleep, dreaming, not knowing what was about to happen just moments later." I was with the other stewards during the evacuation of the passengers to the lifeboats. Women and children were the first to be evacuated. I was helping passengers when one of the ship's officers ordered me to get into a lifeboat to show others it was safe. When I did, others followed, and suddenly, someone thrust a swaddled baby into my hands. Without a second thought, I hugged the child to my chest to keep it warm while the Titanic was sinking. I didn't let go of the baby until our lifeboat was rescued by the Carpathia, a ship that came to our aid. And that baby was my mother, right? My grandmother would look at my mother's face, hug her tightly and say yes, she was the angel her mother gifted to me. Unfortunately, her mother sank into the ocean and was never found, but I raised her as my own. My mother would cry and kiss my grandmother, saying, "You are the most precious gift God gave me, Mom. I never thought I would have a mother other than you. I know my real mother is now deep in the ocean, but there is someone who took care of me every day, the one my daughter calls grandmother." Violet would cry out of joy and hug my mom tightly in her arms every time she told this part of the story. I would ask her to continue and share her experience about her last survival. She would say, "I was lucky to survive one of the most terrible shipwrecks in history. My mind was consumed by these two accidents, and now I was a mother with responsibilities. When I came back home, my father had passed away, and I was in grief and sadness for a long time. My siblings were now teenagers and they helped with the housework and raising your mother. My aunt told me I had to continue my job to make ends meet. Now I had a child and 8 siblings who needed my income. I fought against my depression and the hard times and decided to go back to work. I worked for another 4 years peacefully with no accidents or danger, thinking that all the bad days were behind me. Little did I know, destiny had more in store for me. Your mother was around 4 at that time, walking and talking. I never brought her onto the ship, not once, because I never wanted her to experience what I had. I wanted her to have what I never had, a real childhood. I tried to teach her what toys were, how to play, and what it meant to have fun as a child. Near the Olympic and Titanic, the third sister ship was Britannic. It had sailed successfully many times but had recently been converted into a hospital ship. It was painted white with red crosses, and it was bigger and more luxurious than both the Olympic and Titanic. The HMS Britannic was a ship from World War I. Originally designed as a luxury passenger liner, it was converted into a hospital ship due to the outbreak of the war. Its new mission was to transport wounded soldiers and provide medical care to those affected by the conflict. It was in 1916 when I took a job there as a nurse. The ship sailed through the Aegean Sea on the cold day of November 21. The Britannic had sailed these waters many times and was often referred to as the Old Reliable because it had previously saved a ship from sinking in the ocean. The line had high hopes that this ship wouldn't meet the same fate as its 2 sister ships, Titanic and Olympic. Unfortunately, on that fateful day, the Britannic was not so fortunate. It struck an underwater mine. I was fortunate to survive the 3rd shipwreck in my life, though this rescue was by far more challenging than the previous 2. After the explosion, the massive Britannic began sinking rapidly, and within an hour it was completely submerged. There was no time to board a lifeboat, so I dove into the freezing cold waters. I swam to the nearest lifeboat and climbed aboard. But the danger wasn't over yet. The ship's propellers were still turning and pulling the lifeboat toward them. Just in time, I jumped off the boat to escape the deadly pull, but my ordeal was far from over. While in the water, I was dragged beneath the ship's hull and struck my head. The only thing that saved me from losing consciousness, and possibly my life, was my thick hair. Eventually, I broke free from the engine's pull and was rescued by another boat. In the years that followed, I dealt with persistent headaches. When I finally saw a doctor, he told me just how lucky I had been to survive. The incident on the Britannic had caused a skull fracture. Despite surviving 3 shipwrecks, I didn't let them stop me. I continued working on cruise liners until 1950. My grandmother Violet sailed around the world twice aboard the luxurious Belgian land. Thankfully, the string of misfortunes came to an end, and she never experienced another shipwreck. In 1950, she moved to Great Ashfield in Suffolk County after having worked at sea for nearly 42 years. Finally satisfied with her career, she settled into a spacious 16th-century cottage. As her grandchild, I too became a grandmother to 3 wonderful children. I often share my grandmother's story with my grandkids. I consider myself incredibly lucky to have been raised by the woman who adopted my mother. I still have her memory notebook, filled with tales of her adventures at sea, and I'm happy to share them with you. If you have any questions about her life on the ships, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm here to tell you the untold stories.